Don't say Indian. It's offensive to Indigenous people. From my experience and what I've seen, heard, lived over my 31 years of life growing up on the res, this is not true. And the topic of addressing Indigenous people correctly is one of the most common questions and conversations that just freaks people out for some reason. Now, I had a conversation with my granny about this topic, which I'll show in a second, but this is a very important topic that people often have a problem with understanding how to address Indigenous people. The missing piece here that makes it such an important conversation is that this is about self-identification and self-determination of Indigenous people in Canada, which I'll explain after we talk to Granny Susie. Why and when in certain situations you say you were an Indian, because whenever someone's really freaked out about addressing Indigenous elders or Indigenous people at all, and I tell them that you have said I'm an Indian and that's how you grew up, and some people they're shocked by that because they've heard that that's just so offensive, and I try to educate, share my experiences. One thing is going to be offensive to someone, and to someone else that's appropriate. Everyone is different. Before this episode starts, I have a small favor to ask from you. 89% of people who watch this channel don't subscribe. So if you've ever liked any of the videos we've posted, if you like this channel, can you please do me a quick favor and hit that subscribe button? It helps the channel more than you know, and the bigger the channel gets, the better we can together make an impact towards Indigenous truth and reconciliation. Thank you and enjoy this episode. What I'd like to ask you is, when someone asks about your background, what do you say generally? What have you maybe said before? And what do you say now?
We grew up in the 40s, 50s, 60s, being Indian.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until maybe the 80s or so that the term First Nation and Aboriginal came about. But for me, I see nothing wrong with calling myself an Indian. I do say I'm a First Nation person, only because that's the word.
Yeah. That's what people recognize.
Yeah. But I'm going to ask a person when you're first talking to them. First of all, I don't know why you'd want to ask them if they're an Indian or not.
Yeah.
You'd let them carry the conversation and right to that, because people do get offended. First Nation people do get offended, especially the ones that were born after the 60s. If you call them Indians, they get offended. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't.
This is kind of a different angle to that whole topic of addressing yourself as an Indian. But do you think there's a certain power in saying I am this, and then someone then might think that that's offensive, that having no power anymore because you're kind of taking ownership of a certain way of being addressed? Do you think that there's certain power in really just being proud of whatever you are, no matter what, if it's your cultural background or your personality, anything, and just taking ownership of who you are, so that no matter what, no matter who says anything about it, it doesn't have power over you because you are owning it?
And that's right. If you're going to be offended over things like that, that's trivial, I think, nowadays. Mm-hmm. Because you are what you are. And you should be proud of what you are, no matter who it is.
Right. Yeah. I remember for years of past relationships, I was told that I was not social, or, that I was things that were mean, but they were also kind of true. I am introverted, I am shy, I do keep to myself. And those were kind of used as insults. Whereas now that I've spent time connecting with myself and I've taken ownership of who I am, and now when I meet new people or introduce myself or talk about myself, I talk about those same things, those exact same titles, but with grace and with pride instead of shame. Mm-hmm. So I feel it's not the exact same thing as saying I'm an Indian, or yes, I'm a proud Indigenous person, but it kind of is the same, because you're taking ownership over something that could hurt you, but you're not allowing it to.
And then we face lots and lots of discrimination, racism. We still do.
Yeah.
And it's something that for me, I just accept it. That's part of life. That's part of the way it is, and you don't let it bother you, because you know yourself that you're an okay person. Mm-hmm. and you're just as good as the next good. Mm-hmm. The next woman.
Yeah. Next person. Yep. Okay. Now, what advice would you give for someone who doesn't know what to say to the question of what is your background? Either they were removed from their family or adopted, or something, they just don't know their family and they don't know how to answer the question of what is your background? But maybe they know they have Indigenous heritage. What advice would you give for someone like that?
If they didn't know, mm-hmm. and they wanted to know or didn't want to know?
They want to know, but they just feel so they're triggered every time they're asked what nation are you from or something, and they don't.
I would tell them that if it bothers them, try and find out. try and find out, because there's lots of ways of knowing where it is that you come from. And there are a lot of cases like that.
Yeah.
There's lots of people like that who don't know.
And no matter what age, you should look into it.
If it bothers you, if it doesn't bother you, then that's fine. But if it bothers you, look into it and see.
And what do you mean by bothers? Do you mean if it bothers you, it obviously is meaningful or something?
If it disturbs you.
Okay.
Yeah. If it's disturbing to you for someone to ask you that, and you want to know or you don't know.
And I think sometimes it could be disturbing, but not necessarily like a negative disturbing, but maybe they're just like curious and they feel like there's maybe something missing and they want to like look into it or something, right?
And it's funny because everybody that I know who was taken or who was adopted, they always seem to find their way home. They always seem to find where they came from.
I met this man a couple weeks ago who said that he was adopted and that on his mother's side or his father's side, he was First Nations, and that he felt like he was too old to like look into it. Like he's like, I'm already 70 years old. Like, what's it worth now to know? But that's why I asked if you think that someone could be too old to.
You're never too old.
No,
you're never too old. Because he's 70 years old doesn't mean that he's not going to live another
30 years.
Another 30 years.
Yeah. Or make realizations that kind of help you know more about yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I remember like growing up, my earliest memories, we would call ourselves Native, right? Or even like Indian. Like on your status card, it says like Indian status. Like that's what it's called. Even when like people realize it says Indian status, and then it's like, how can it possibly be offensive technically to address someone as an Indian? I don't know. But a lot of people like say that it is. So
and we live under the Indian Act.
Yeah.
Currently, like we still do. It's still, so it's not a foreign thing.
No. But it is very, very like common in like educational environments and in corporate environments. Like calling someone an Indian is like, no. Like, don't do it. So that's why I like talking about like, not necessarily like always like challenging it and saying like, well, it's not like, that's not the truth. Like you can't just like set these rules and like, that's no matter what, like what to follow. You like,
and follow the lead of the person that you're talking to.
I remember like even doing a Facebook Live a couple of years ago where this was like the topic, and like, it might've been like Anne or someone who commented, and she was like, I identify as like Anishinaabe. Like that's how I identify, and like whatever nation or like group. And so like, that's even better, like as like an ally or as someone gets more educated in like the tribes and in nations and stuff, then they can be more specific with how they address someone.
I just think that's a topic that's going to be around forever.
And it'll probably be there'll probably be a newer, better way to address, like, who knows, right?
Yeah.
Throughout colonization, Canada determined what Native people were called. First Indians, First Nations, Indigenous. All of these are labels that were determined by the government, not self-determined and not self-identified or decided upon by Indigenous groups themselves. Now, what does self-determination mean? When it comes to the right of Indigenous people to self-determine in Canada, have you ever stopped to ask yourself what this really means? As we know, for centuries, Indigenous people were subject and have still been subjected to oppression and mistreatment at the hands of settlers and colonial forces, leaving us with little power or autonomy. But today, there's an increased awareness of the need for self-determination and a desire for more freedom and more control over our own communities. Some of the biggest areas of self-determination are land, rights, culture and language, and governance. Now, land rights pertain to the recognition of traditional lands that were taken away from Indigenous people throughout settler colonialism. Language and culture refers to protection of language and culture for future generations of Indigenous people by creating spaces for practicing traditions such as smudging ceremonies or revitalization of language classes, things like that. Now, governance is all about the ability of Indigenous people to participate in national dialogues, both political and economical, in order to ensure that our perspectives are heard on important issues like pipelines, reconciliation initiatives, and have control over our own governments and sovereignty issues as well. Now, all of these things are areas that are relevant to identity of Indigenous people, how we prefer to be addressed, which which varies from nation to nation and is diverse from community to community and is different from person to person. Now, what do you think about addressing Indigenous people, what my grand shared in the video, and whether calling someone is an Indian is acceptable or not? I mean, that is what is read on our status cards. Now, what are your thoughts about this? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you have an amazing day, and we'll see you next time.